Good afternoon, and welcome to Employed Physician Network Transformation, put on by HSG and sponsored by the Ohio Hospital Association as part of OHA's Hospital Leadership Track for the 2021 Ohio Hospital Association meeting. My name is Travis Ansel. With me is Dr. Terry McWilliams. Today, we'll be leading you through a discussion on our view of helping employed networks kind of get a vision for where they're heading and kind of set a new direction. Very important work, for all health systems in the country right now. And so in order to do that, we'll be basically covering three things. One, understanding the evolution of employed physician networks, because when we start talking about transformation, we feel it's important for everyone to understand kind of what we're seeing nationally as it relates to employed physician network development. Two, we'll kind of lay out our process of what does it mean to actually transform a physician network. And then three, talk about some of the components and how these things all work together. Of course, since this is a virtual presentation, we will not be live for question and answers, but there will be the opportunity to submit questions or follow-ups via email, which we will respond to as we get them. I guess, Terry, one comment about this presentation, again, since it is virtual and we are recording this on March 23rd, there is a lot of content in this deck. Some of it we will cover, some of it is there for additional reference. Since it's a virtual presentation, we have the opportunity to include a little more depth of detail that we might not typically cover in a live presentation format. So if we skip over a few slides, don't worry about that. It's in there for your reference and for your follow-up. Okay, so getting just to our view of the world. So why are we talking about this, or why do we have the perceptions that we have on employed networks? At HSG, Terry and I focus on helping health systems with their employed physician network growth. As part of our overall thought leadership, we developed what we call our HSG physician network growth phases, which attempts to give some structure to how we see employed networks developing across the country. We tend to hear a lot of health systems laying out the same problems to us as if they are new or as if they are unique. And the good news / bad news is a lot of the challenges that health systems have had with growth of their employed networks over time, really we're seeing in most markets and most hospitals. And so we kind of put together this, what we call the growth phases, in order to basically show that networks do kind of grow on kind of the same trend. Now how well networks progress through this, Terry, is very variable. But everyone kind of goes through the same experience. Wouldn't you agree?
Agree, and sometimes some of the networks we deal with wonder about growth when they think physical growth or numeric growth. And another or a synonym for what we're talking about here could be maturation, couldn't it? Here's how as networks mature, and hopefully they do mature, they go through these phases. So just trying to differentiate between the perception of numeric or volume or size growth and actual development of the network itself.
Yeah. And just to put a couple points to that. So, I mean, just looking at our main 6 phases here, not many networks are still in what we call the novice phase, which is where we're not employing as a strategy and not trying to build an employed network, but maybe we've aggregated physicians in an employed state for whatever reason. That was where a lot of networks were kind of in the mid 2000s as we started rebuilding physician networks. Most markets, Terry, we've seen shift to employment as the dominant alignment model. We call that phase kind of the rapid growth phase, when we went from not having a whole lot of employed providers in our health system to having the majority of our medical staff employed. That's sometimes driven by economic factors, most often is driven by competitive factors. But they're acknowledging that in most markets, health systems had to rapidly scale its number of employed providers. From our perspective, that inevitably leads to a phase called operational chaos, which is kind of paying for all the sins of our rapid growth. We brought the providers in, we call them a group, we've changed their W-2, but functionally we really haven't changed a whole lot. We might have them in a multi-specialty group, but there's no sense of a multi-specialty group amongst the providers. There's no common policies and procedures. There's no brand. We have no infrastructure we don't have adequate infrastructure to support the group. And for all the excitement, Terry, that rapid growth creates, operational chaos is where we start realizing we have all these providers, but we don't know what we're doing with them. And now the sustainability, the financial sustainability really becomes a question.
Yeah, and some of that could be actually an outgrowth of that rapid growth phase, couldn't it? Because it's too many growths in one sentence, but I apologize for that. But during that acquisition phase, and for many systems, that was the mechanism for rapid growth was acquisition, and often with practices approaching the network saying we're having financial issues, save us or lose us. But often in an acquisition process, there was, yes, we want you in our community. We don't want anything to change for you, and then nothing changes. So they're out there functioning very relatively autonomously and relatively independently, even though collectively in that named grouping.
Yeah. And we'll hit on this in a little bit, but then we find that to be the phase that a lot of employed networks get stuck in. Lasting in some cases a decade or more. I think from our view, it's where a lot of most employed networks in the country are right now, at least in our view of the world. The good news is once we transition past that phase, and that'll be kind of a focus of our transformation presentation today, it gets to the point where we do have more of a strategic focus, which is our fourth phase, which is where we have a developing culture, which is where we have infrastructure that allows us to not just focus on day-to-day operations, but start developing the capabilities of the group and start transitioning it towards our fifth phase, which is where the network really is able to become strategically and culturally integrated with the health system and focus on the delivery of value-based care, something beyond our ability to produce volume, where we have proficiencies that allow the health system to succeed in a value-based environment. And then the sixth phase, which is kind of where we want all networks to eventually transition towards, is what we call high performing. So it's where we aren't just developing value-based care abilities, but they're really ingrained in the culture of the organization, Terry, and we're capable of continuously improving on our performance.
Yeah, and the hallmark of that high performing area, we'll talk about the different characteristics, but in any phase, you can't sit on your laurels, right? You have to continually expend effort, resources, and invest in the group to keep it moving along that curve. And you can look at the bell-shaped curve and think, well, once you get over the hump, it's all downhill from there. But actually, it's a continual uphill battle because each gain becomes a little bit more difficult to achieve as you become a very proficient organization. So continually working toward that high performing network, and once you achieve that, continually expending effort to be even higher performing than you think you are.
Yeah. And just buttoning that up a little bit. So, when we talk about a high performing employee physician network, it's one that at its core, as I referenced, is integrated with the health system vision and strategic direction, which is, I think, always the biggest. I think working around the country right now, Terry, I think that's the one thing when we talk to CEOs of health systems, that I think through all of the challenges that they voice, I think that's summarizing it. That's the biggest gap, right? I have this entity of employed providers, and we're still focusing on operations and finances and not the strategic value that this group can produce for us once it becomes really integrated with our strategic direction.
Or they don't realize that's what they want because they're solely focused on, the fact that we keep losing money and we don't get anywhere. They don't know what they want, except they don't want it to just be sitting there and losing money for them. And so, having the desire to get to a point, they just don't know what that point is sometimes.
Yeah. The second major component being that it has a multi-specialty group culture that is actually present. So we hear a lot about culture groups talking about their culture, but when asked to define their culture, I think that's when we start to get some blank stares and some questions back when we talk to health system leadership and providers in a group. And then third is able to produce high value, predictable results, which of course, as we transition into a value-based care delivery environment, will be what we have to be able to do. And there's a number of other characteristics that we would consider, a part of a high-performing physician network, which we won't go through here. But it's important to understand at least these first three things, because that's kind of the core component of what we're going to recommend in our next section, which is talking about how you transform a physician network, because we have to have a vision of what high performance means to us. And from our perspective, it has to incorporate these elements. So we have to have a plan for working towards some form of this high performance put in the context of each of our own individual health systems. So what happens, the challenge, Terry, I think we're seeing with a lot of health systems is what happens when we stop moving? As I said earlier, in the operational chaos phase, it's not a phase that we just linearly progress through. Sometimes it can last for a decade. It can last forever, technically forever. I guess we've been monitoring it for a decade. But getting stuck in operational chaos, it's you start seeing things like the providers who may have once had the appetite for strategic discussions and culture discussions and wanting to be a part of something bigger. You start to feel a little bit of disengagement and providers becoming detached from where could we be going to just trying to deal with the day-to-day. Our network leadership, which should be focused on driving the group forward and helping us bring strategy from the health system perspective into the group, gets really focused on day-to-day issues, dealing with compensation agreements, dealing with EMR issues, dealing with our 30 practices, which all have different policies and procedures, and trying to figure out how we deal with an individual problem in an individual practice. Physician leadership, which may have never been put together, or if it had, may have become really disengaged because they had nothing to work on. It isn't a prevalent part of the organization's management structure. This often leads to frequent turnover in executive or director level roles. And I think, Terry, we hear, from health system executive teams, we just can't find the right person, or we can't find someone that can run this group well. And while there are a finite number of people that can run a 200 provider multi-specialty practice in this country, it's often the structure that is the failure and not necessarily the person. There are a lot of people that could succeed in the right structure, very few people that can succeed in the wrong structure. And then the biggest problem from our perspective is when you get into this state, it's really hard to move out of, because it's really hard to kind of take that step back and say, what does this group need to be? Because you're so focused on all these other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Travis, the point you made about you can get stuck. Sometimes when we look at this diagram, it looks like a nice simple bell-shaped curve with, you move by standard deviations along, and everything just proceeds, in step. And it's not the case, right? You can dwell in any of the phases for a prolonged period of time and perhaps never advance if you can't get beyond some of these issues.
Yeah. And that right there, what you said, Terry, is why we're talking about what we call physician network transformation today. Because if we're going to move out of this state where we are stuck, where where we have a hard time thinking about a different environment that we're living in, because we've become so ingrained in kind of this operational chaos phase, what we have to have is the context for a significant change and taking the network in a new direction. And that at its core is kind of the definition of what physician network transformation means to us. How do we set a new context, or how do we set a new direction for our employed physician network? And how do we create the context with both our leadership team and with our providers to say, starting tomorrow, we're doing something different and we're heading down a new path. So that'll take us into our overview of what physician network transformation means to us. And this is a process that, Terry, quite frankly, we've arrived at organically through our work with health systems over the last 10 to 15 years, which is what we've seen to be really effective in putting networks on a new path. The first of which, so three main phases with a lot of detail that we'll talk through, but the first of which is creating a shared vision of an ideal future state. So what does the group need to look like 5 to 10 years out as it matures? what does it look like? What does it feel like? What do providers want to be a part of? What would they be proud to be a part of? What do they think will help recruit and retain new providers as our network grows? And this is, setting the shared vision in place, Terry, gives us something to do besides manage the day-to-day. It gives us that vision to work towards that we can ingrain in our leadership structures.
Right, and it does it in a way that's not, I just want to be, it's not just I want to be different than we are today. It's what is it that we want to be? And Travis, this might be an opportune time to say, we've focused a little bit on operational chaos as an area, but this applies no matter where you are in your growth phases, right? Just because you've achieved where you are now, where is it that you want to continue to work toward? And establishing this vision at the beginning, but also periodically thereafter. But no matter where you are in your maturation and growth, this process will work for you. And knowing where it is you want to be and keep re-envisioning that ideal future state is a key.
Yeah. And then important. So once we've kind of identified, what the future state needs to be, now that we've taken that step back from how we got to where we were, in our history of our group's growth, now that we're looking forward to what we need to be, the second part of our transformation process would be we need to reorganize the group from an organizational structure standpoint, from a management infrastructure standpoint, and from a physician leadership and governance standpoint to ensure that we have the right structures, the right resources, the right people in those seats, and that the group is positioned for continued growth and continued performance improvement towards the execution of the shared vision.
Yeah, and this is another one of those areas that if we focus on operational chaos, as you mentioned, Travis, is woefully inadequate, right, across the board. So there's a lot to do there. But as a group matures in the process, it's also reassessing this, and does it still make sense? Yeah. Are we maximizing all the potential, and have we really anticipated the changes that we've undergone? And adjusted our leadership and management structure accordingly.
Yeah. And then the third part is with the vision in place and a group structured so that we have at least the capability to launch performance improvement initiatives and start trying to progress across the physician network growth phases. The third phase is really executing on that. So one, it's taking stock of with the right leadership structure in place, what gaps do we have in our current performance and what might portend gaps in future performance. It's aligning provider incentives in the direction of our shared vision, both in current state and future state. And then it's developing kind of a culture of improving continuously so that we don't fail or we don't stand still in our attempted progression across the curve.
Yeah, so once we know where we want to go and we have the machinery to get there, are we executing on the design? And, have we done deep enough drill downs into our areas of, as you mentioned, the gaps or potential areas for improvement? But it's also going beyond, analyzing, planning, designing, and implementing to, are we achieving the results we anticipated with that change? And can we sustain the gain if we are achieving the results we intend? Or if we're not achieving the results that we intend, how do we need to modify it to move forward? And even if you go through that cycling process and again, we're using a term of continual or continuous improvement, not as a methodology, but as a thought process and philosophy. Designing, we've all experienced, or we think we designed a great process, we're not getting the results, and it's just that the process is not being executed as designed or as we thought it would be. So going back and making sure that we can, create gains, sustain the gains, and improve on those gains over time.
All right, so Terry, so let's jump into providing some detail around what building a shared vision means. And from our perspective, the shared vision, as we talked about, is kind of the beacon. It illuminates where we're heading in the future, and should bring everyone, if done correctly, bring everyone together working towards a common purpose, which really kind of becomes foundational for our strategy for moving the network forward, for building our culture, and basically everything that our network needs to do to kind of come together, and work towards the same future state. We typically have, you know, within a shared vision statement, it's not just here's what we want to be, but it's the accountability, Terry, of both the leaders of the network and the providers. How are we both going to contribute to this, as well as the staff, so that it's not just here's this thing out in the future that we want to be, but here's how we're going to get there, and here's the role of each of us and getting to that part. And then it really what with it defined, what it really becomes is kind of the action plan. The shared vision should generate its own action plan for how we get there. So it's not just a statement of vision, it's actually a plan for achieving vision.
Right, and Travis, we like to equate the shared vision to providing a roadmap for your future. We've had one client that actually called it their network's constitution, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're going to work toward them forever and ever, amen. And it really can be that type of document, but it also, as we'll talk about, needs to be reevaluated as you evolve to make sure it's still pertinent and it's a living, breathing document, not just something that has been developed and sits on the shelf.
Yeah. And Terry, I think while we've seen, some variation in each of our, each time we've gone through this process with a health system, pictured here on the left is kind of the core elements of every vision statement that we see that we feel must be addressed, because just by the nature of what an employed physician network is and how it operates, that we must have a vision for what the future state of that component looks like. So let's go through each of those in just a little bit of detail. One, we find it really helpful to have an actual definition of what our desired culture is, because a culture is one of those things we always hear from networks that they have it, but they also have a really hard time defining what it is. And when pressed to think about it, thinking about common philosophy, common policies and procedures, universal contracting structures, everything that kind of brings us together in a common purpose, beyond yes, we're all working together to deliver patient care. Having that definition of culture, I think we consider probably is the most critical to actually executing upon a shared vision.
Yeah, and it creates shared expectations, doesn't it? So you mentioned before mutual accountability. It's hard to be accountable for something if you don't know what the expectations are. So developing this kind of sets that foundational expectations so that we do have shared behaviors and can come together in a more cohesive fashion.
Yeah, and then probably not just as important, maybe just a little bit below, but defining the leadership structure. And so where does the network actually, how does the leadership structure fit into the network itself, and where does that fit within the health system? And I think, what the biggest change we usually see going from shared vision statement to changing leadership structures is probably around the roles of physician leaders, because for most organizations that are kind of jumping into this process, I think have recognized their shortcomings in involving physicians in the actual management structure of the group, and bringing dyad leadership at least the ultimate, the top level of the organization, but maybe even integrated it into the actual management infrastructure and organizational structure.
Yeah, so the whole of the organizational structure almost forms the backbone for the group, right? And then you can fill out the meat of the skeleton from there. But you Travis, you hit right on. Early on, and even as groups evolve, having a well-defined physician and APP leadership structure, tends to take it over the top, especially if you're able to develop very effective, dyad leadership teams at the executive level and the major division level.
Yeah. And related to leadership, but the management infrastructure that we use to actually manage the group, make sure we have the right seats, the right people in those, and that they have the right responsibilities, and that they're actually able to execute on those responsibilities is critically important. I think, Terry, the biggest thing we tend to see from a management infrastructure perspective is organizations, health systems have typically underinvested in the infrastructure, and that makes some sense, right? When you're responding to growing subsidies and you're concerned about the financial performance, it's hard to say we need to add a couple $1 million or $1 million of FTEs to help us support the group. But as we look at groups that have progressed past the operational chaos and are actually, into that strategic focus and value phase, they're the ones that have actually made the investment, reduced span of control, and actually maximized their practice operations.
Right. So you mentioned an operational chaos. The focus is always on the losses, and what's the answer to losses, right? You cut staffing, you cut resources, which just causes a downhill spiral from there. So investing in management infrastructure on both the operations side, but also the dedicated support services side is crucial. On the operations side, very often groups, I can't think of a great word, but short is the only word I can think of. Practice management, right? The in-office management, and as you mentioned, span of control, having managers that have, trying to manage 20 offices, and people don't understand why they aren't physically present and able to do more with those. So span of control on the operations side, working on all the different levels of the leadership structure to make sure they're adequately supported. But then the dedicated resources side, you can't have one person managing this. The operations side can't be solely sufficient. So, having data analysts, financial analysts, quality support, HR support that's pertinent and huge would be the informatics support that's dedicated to the ambulatory structures and not just on other aspects of the health system.
Yeah. Fourth common element of a shared vision, strategic focus and growth. So how does the employed network manage its own strategic initiatives? I think too often we see the strategy of the employed network lost in the strategy of the health system, which, while we certainly want the employed group integrated into the strategy of the health system, we don't want the health system purely driving that strategy, because to help build our culture, our leadership structure, and create a sense of group, the employed network needs to own some thought process around how do we strategically expand, how do we develop, position, and develop clinical capabilities within our community, how are we going to evolve our value-based care delivery and population health management capabilities, which again are all elements that span health system strategy, not just employed group strategy. But we can't, from an employed network leadership role, advocate those roles to health system leadership, but must work with them.
Yeah, and as in most things we talk about, Travis, it's a synergy, isn't it? Just as the dyad structure is designed for synergy between administrative and clinical mindsets, this has to be a synergy between network strategy and health system strategy. How do we fit together like hand in glove, but how does one help drive the other?
Yeah. Fifth element, customer experience. So mutually defining a shared vision of how are we going to serve our customers, not just patients, but also the providers in the community that we work with that are not part of the employed group. Maybe bringing in a formal definition of what patient-centric care means to us, because while we may all, I think, Terry, the common dynamic we feel is our providers may all feel like they deliver patient-centric care, but that also may mean different things, practice by practice, provider by provider, and having a formal definition of that allows us to kind of evolve our care delivery and our brand around that. Any comments on customer experience?
Well, all too often we interpret customer experience to be patient experience, right? Focus on that sole external customer, and many of us on the clinical side don't really like to think of patients as customers, but face it, this is a business. They are our customer. They're one of our primary customers. But as you mentioned, Travis, not losing sight of our other customers and treating everybody, with the utmost dignity and respect, because it's all about relationships. If we're going to really be sustainable, have a great reputation, we have to build all of our relationships not just our patient relationships. And your point about patient centricity, as clinicians, we think we always keep the patient's best interests at heart, but we design our practices on the basis of us as providers, right? Our hours of operations, when we handle things, do we close for lunch? Do we have after hours access? How quickly do we respond to needs? What's our access like across the board? Sometimes these don't quite get to the point of patient centricity in spite of our intention to do the best we can for our patients.
Yep. Perfect. And then sixth element, provider and staff well-being. So obviously provider burnout, has been an issue that has become, kind of forefront of mind in the last 3 to 5 years. I think we found it very effective to in the shared vision process, Terry, have providers give feedback into, what do we consider, what does that look like from a future vision standpoint? And how does the group work to develop mechanisms to kind of monitor and manage provider burnout in a way that's actually effective?
And this is one of those that's bubbled up from outside of our organization, right? We can read about how important it is, but these individuals are experiencing it, and this is something that's come to the fore just in our work with the groups. Never has it been a higher priority than with COVID. But even prior to COVID, it was recognized progressively as an issue, and very importantly, the advancement of thinking about provider and staff well-being beyond personal resilience, and having organizational programs in place to measure the degree to which it exists, but also to allow personal resilience to flourish, because organizationally you're making changes in the environment.
Yeah, very good. The seventh element that we see for shared visions is typically having a quality vision or a quality plan vision. I think, Terry, sometimes the biggest point of confusion is, we're already working on quality from a health system perspective, from a medical staff perspective. This is bringing in the concept of us having a truly ambulatory focused health plan that's really relevant to our employed network.
Right, and you're right, Travis. You hear from systems all the time, and well, we have a quality committee. Okay, what does it focus on? Well, all of our quality measures. Well, what are they like? And the systems have had hospital-based quality for a while because it's been driven by payers, and the requisite requirement that medical staffs are responsible for the quality care rendered in their delegated authority from the board. But often ignored is the whole quality structure in the employed network, in the office-based environment, and it's gotten increased attention with some of the CMS-driven processes, former PQRS and others that and the value-based metrics that have morphed into the quality payment program. But there's still a large disconnect between what payers are expecting in the quality front and what networks are delivering, in large part because they aren't aware of what's in the payer contracts. So this is an opportunity to focus on this area in a comprehensive way, looking at all aspects of quality, not just clinical metrics, but the patient experience, which we alluded to a little bit before, what it means to be a member of the group and some citizenry kind of areas, but also operational efficiencies and looking at things like patient access and other areas. So this is an opportunity to really build on that and also to develop the management infrastructure to support it.
Perfect. Our eighth element, brand, which again, this is another element where defining a shared vision of what does our brand look like is generally it's another one of those areas where if you ask a health system leadership or a provider within the group, what's the brand like? They might talk about the name, they might talk about the logo, but actually defining what is the experience like of being a part of our practice network from a patient perspective. What does it mean to deliver care, reliably, that across every practice setting that, where we have that kind of unique, or not unique, but that consistent, uniform experience for the patient. And what does it take to actually get that? Because that's something that's frequently disconnected, even in networks that have been together a while.
Right, it's delivering on those expectations reliably, consistently, no matter point of contact, with a network, and that's huge, and often requires a whole lot of work on all these other elements to get to the point where you can do this reliably, consistently, and where your reputation mirrors what you'd like it to be.
Yeah, and then our ninth element is financial sustainability, which I think over the last 10, 15 years, the definition of financial sustainability is whatever the health system CFO said it had to be, right? So if we're doing well, then we can subsidize a lot. If we're not doing well, then we can subsidize a little. And I think Terry, what we've seen is the providers feeling kind of very cut out and not really in control of that discussion. So bringing a definition of what does it mean to be financially sustainable, not necessarily a target number or a target percentage of revenue or a target subsidy, but a definition of what does it mean to be financially sustainable, and how are we going to monitor and manage that within the organization from a leadership and a provider perspective.
Right, and even at the level of the board would ask questions like, well, these practices were financially viable before. What's the problem now? We shouldn't have to do any subsidy. Getting to where what's reasonable. Let's look at benchmarks. Are we optimizing our operations so that we exceed benchmarks? It's that type of different thinking that hopefully evolves over time and has everybody working toward that same end.
Perfect. So with a shared vision in place, again, which what you've seen in the last two slides is what we consider to be kind of the common elements that we would recommend walking through. The next step really becomes evolving leadership and management structures that support the future state of the network. So from our perspective, that's I think what we see a lot of organizations existing with in terms of their leadership and management infrastructure is basically whatever the group naturally progressed to as a result of kind of piecemeal additions over time. We may have at one point brought in an executive director. We may have at one point brought in one or two practice directors, but we've never really taken that step back and said, okay, with the size that our group is now and its diverse geographic locations, its diverse specialties, its size, how do we create a structure that's actually supportive of what we have now and what we plan to have going forward? Of course, changing all those things, there's a lot of barriers to it, right, Terry? So if we start saying we need to manage this differently, and we've seen this, especially with a lot of larger groups that have kind of let things mature way too long, there's a lot of disruption to what providers have gotten used to. So if they're used to controlling their schedules, if they're used to kind of running their own practices and having one practice management person that really reports to them and not to anybody else, changing the organizational structure and management infrastructure represents a severe disruption to provider autonomy. For a lot of networks, just changing the status quo. So why are we going to do something different, and why it's hard enough running our day to day with all the challenges that are happening to us day to day. It's hard to really take that step back and say we're going to change the way we do things. Sometimes we just lack the context for why we're going to change the way that we're doing things. A lot of organizations are burdened with not having a leadership structure with which to formally engage physicians. So it makes it really hard to say, we're going to make these changes, or we're going to work with you to make these changes, when the structures don't exist to formally engage those physicians. And then for a lot of organizations, it's really hard just to find the time. So if we're focused on fighting day-to-day fires, how do we take a step back and really define how we're going to run this network efficiently going forward? Which seems like a great problem to solve, but if you don't have the resources to solve it. So when we talk about setting the shared vision and creating the context to get past some of those barriers, what do we recommend focusing on, Terry? We recommend, one, elevating the employed provider network, getting it out from under the hospital on the org chart and making it a peer of your hospital or hospitals, so that it's recognized, that it's not subservient to the hospital, that it's not dependent on stealing resources from the hospital to achieve its function, but that we have a health system and that the group is a critical part of it. We recommend building dyad leadership structure. So anytime we set a shared vision, as we noted, one of the inevitable components is we need to involve physicians more in the operations and management of the group. So building dyad leadership structures, at least at the leadership level, but even down to kind of your director levels, makes a lot of sense, and it really gives an opportunity to formalize and unify the organizational structure. Three, we recommend aligning specialties. So I think we've seen just about everything there is to see in how specialties report up through an organizational structure. A lot of it is based upon the capability of maybe practice supervisors or directors, as opposed to a strategic approach of unifying specialties that maybe have similar philosophies and operational approaches. So grouping those together makes a lot of sense. We've seen a lot of organizations struggle with geography. So as our network was small and clustered with practices, maybe in our primary market, it was very easy to manage geography. Every health system strategy now has an imperative to grow. And so as we've gotten really geographically diverse, how do we account for geography in our leadership and management infrastructure? And then five, I think we've referenced it already, Terry, but one of the biggest sins that we see of management infrastructure from a group that really hasn't taken that step back is we've added a lot of practices without adding a lot of people, and we've created really unwieldy span of controls for the people that we're hoping are able to manage and develop our network, and that creates a number of barriers which lead to substandard performance.
Right. And, Travis, you mentioned this before when you talked about having, revolving door of executive directors. There are only so many things that we can realistically expect individuals to undertake. And you just can't be successful if you're trying to manage, if you're in the management structure and trying to manage 20 direct reports daily. It just is unwieldy and predicts at least suboptimal performance, if not failure, right? But just building this, like for instance, building the dyad leadership structure, you just can't put people in the seats, right? You have to work on them developing back to the synergy, synergistic function at the leadership level, but also throughout the management structure, so that the sum is greater. The total is the total effect is greater than just the sum of the parts, because people are now working much better together. They're able to get their arms around areas that we've now created the ability for them to be able to manage better, and the outcomes tend to follow.
Yeah. One of the other components of an effective leadership and management infrastructure that we've hit on a couple times is really having an effective, what we term as a provider leadership council, but that leadership group that is basically the summarization of all of our physician leadership activities within the network. We've seen a lot of organizations do this. We've seen very few organizations do what we would consider very well. And I think we've seen a lot of organizations kind of stop and start with engaging physician leaders. One of the biggest barriers being without really having the shared vision in place and something that we're working towards in terms of the long-term development of the group. It's really hard to figure out what we need to talk to the doctors about or what they should be doing when we bring them together in a council function. So Terry, any comments on PLC and committee structures?
Well, the other is what the leadership really envisions them to be, right? There are some senior leaders who have difficulty bringing physicians into the fold of leadership because of the threatening nature of almost the fox guarding the henhouse approach, and much prefer a top-down approach and just want the physician leaders, quote unquote, to champion the causes that administration is putting forward. An effective provider leadership council actually is involved in the problem solving and decision making process and strategic planning process, not as ultimate decision makers, but as part of that leadership continuum. And sometimes it's important to differentiate between leadership and management. I've had some CEOs say, well, we don't expect the leadership council to solve X problem in X practice. And that's correct. That's the manager's responsibility. But if X problem in X practice is actually a ubiquitous problem from all the practices, then that's something that we should all work on and get all the different viewpoints to help solve. And some of those distinctions can be difficult to ferret out at times. But, actually involving in the process and having the council start to generate its own and drive its own agenda, not in a rogue fashion, but consistent with organizational objectives, becomes paramount also. So it's not viewed as only rubber stamping what administration takes to them, or they don't lose their engagement by feeling that, we don't have a say in what comes to us. It's just what administration wants to bring for us to work on. And, Travis listed there's the committee structure, and that can be a key component of how the PLC starts to help drive the agenda and be involved in the problem solving and decision making process, right?
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, Terry, to our next slide, which is, about committee structures and what we commonly see. We see a lot of effective provider leadership councils have different subcommittee structures. Our most common structure involves 5 subcommittees, which really help do the work of the PLC, and give us kind of that comprehensive look from the provider leadership perspective at what's critical to the network. The first of those, Terry, being a quality committee. So we talked about the importance of quality within the context of the shared vision. This is really that group that focuses on ambulatory quality while interfacing with the health system plan, but focused on what's really relevant to ambulatory practices.
Yeah, and some people will cringe at the thought of having peer review entailed in this as well, with how does it mesh with the hospital and health system peer review process? But let's not forget that this isn't just looking at what metrics we're supposed to be doing based on external parameters, but this also focuses internally and should include peer review as well.
Yeah. And similarly, clinical informatics, a lot of the same dynamics, so we're focused on ambulatory optimization of ambulatory EMR and standardizing IT practices across our practice sites. It tends to have a lot of crossover, particularly with quality, but something that should be a part of an effective subcommittee structure from a PLC perspective. Operations and finance, I think we find to be the most common, but also often the most critical, because it tackles the most of those issues, like you talked about, Terry. What is not practice specific, but what is network specific when it comes to issues that impact operations and impact the overall financial performance of the network. We frequently, Terry, recommend provider compensation committees, recognizing with a lot of organizations that are probably going through right now that wish they had a provider compensation committee, when you have issues like the 2021 Medicare physician fee schedule changes, having that group that is aware of what is going on from a compensation plan perspective across the network and can work with administration to adapt it and change it is absolutely critical.
Right, and compensation models change and evolve as you progress along the growth curve, and especially as you get further along on the right side of the curve that we were looking at earlier. And sometimes organizations aren't really ready for a comp committee until you get further along in that strategic focus and beyond, especially when you're looking at non-productivity incentives that have to be updated regularly, both by measure, metric, and target. And this group can help with that, as well as the other committees with their input about clinical quality metrics or operational metrics that might be considered in the comp plan.
And then finally, we tend to recommend a variety of constituency committees, groups that wouldn't normally, have a structure to meet together, but need one in the context of having an effective PLC, the most common of which being kind of a constituency committee for advanced practitioners in the group to give them an opportunity to interface across specialties, across practices, and make their voice heard for issues related to the practice of their care within the network, and having that run through the PLC. So Terry, with us talking about how we develop a shared vision and build the right structure, the logical conclusion of our transformation process is how do we execute upon the shared vision? And again, you made the important caveat that we're not advocating a process of continuous improvement so much as we're talking about a philosophy of building continuous improvement into our network. We think that it focuses on 3 things. One, most critical once we kind of get to this process and the transformation process is ensuring our provider compensation incentives are aligned with our shared vision and supportive of our strategy. Two is having a framework for continuously comprehensively assessing how we're doing operationally and financially and having a framework for working through that. And then three is just building the organizational expectations that we're not just going to do this on we're not going to look at performance improvement on a one-time basis or a project basis, then we're going to get a report and then we're not going to do anything with it. We're going to continually work to improve. We're going to continually work to execute our shared vision, and that's not going to stop at any given point. So when we're talking about aligning incentives under a common compensation philosophy, Terry, I guess at a high level, our philosophy would be organizations need to have a compensation plan that has everyone incentivized in the same direction with warranted specialty-specific variation.
Yeah, and that's succinctly put. And rather than expounding upon that, because every organization is different, it is just a matter of aligning incentives, having everybody going in the same direction, trying to have a common philosophy, but recognizing warranted variation by specialty in terms of rates and incentive measures.
And I think this is also the point where we would say organizations need to be, if you aren't there, you need to be moving towards an evergreen contract model, which incorporates all of those changes, as opposed to a termed model, which requires renegotiation, because it in addition to just needing to be able to evolve things like non-productivity incentives and quality measures on a yearly basis, the administrative burden of renegotiating agreements every 1, 3, 5 years is huge. So secondly, we talked about having a framework for continuously and comprehensively assessing the state of network financial and operational performance. We won't walk through each of these bullets, but essentially having a framework that basically says, how do we increase collections on our existing patient volume, regardless of whether we're under a fee-for-service, fee-for-value, increasing collections on our volume is critical. Similarly, as is decreasing expenses. Similarly is how do we utilize our existing resources to generate more volume? So all these are kind of strategy agnostic questions. They're all group operational issues that can be tackled by your leadership team and run through your PLC. And then finally, Terry, it's not this slide is basically saying what we've talked about on the previous two slides is not enough. We have to build in kind of that philosophy of continuous network improvement.
Right, and we covered this at length earlier when we were talking about this section. But again, planning and doing is just not enough. We have to continually reassess and reanalyze the areas of change to make sure we're achieving the outcomes that we desire. If we are achieving those outcomes, how can we maintain the gain? And if we aren't achieving those outcomes, how do we need to further tweak the system to keep on improving?
And that's really what drives progression across with the shared vision in place and the right structure. That's really what drives networks across the growth phases. Right. All right. Well, with that, we will say thank you to everybody. Again, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions kind of through the presentation app. We welcome your questions. We'd love to discuss any thoughts or observations you had. And with that, we'll say thank you. Dr. McWilliams, thank you for your time as well.
Thank you, Travis. And thanks everyone for participating in this virtually. We hope was informative to you and has value in your day-to-day life.